Dragon Con. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Skeptic Track for 2023. Yay! Woo! We're having a great time, yeah? That's fantastic. So I am so delighted to be able to introduce Donald Prothero. If you've been here over the previous day, he's been here giving some wonderful talks, and we're so excited. This is his first Dragon Con, so right? I've already bragged on how wonderful y'all were, so I'm very happy to welcome Donald Prothero. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Angie. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I know you'd rather be out there with the disco next door, but we'll do the best we can. If it gets too loud in the disco back, well, hopefully they'll turn the sound up so you can hear me. I wore my Area 51 shirt for the occasion. At least I'm doing a minimum cosplay. So, all right. This is something based on a book that Tim Callahan and I published a few years ago about UFOs and aliens mostly. And it was the kind of thing that emerged from the kind of thing I've been done with the Skeptics Society in California for quite a few years. I've been a member since it was founded. And in particular, this topic was something of interest to both of us. It sort of combined the backgrounds of a lot of stuff. I had background in planetary science. I teach it at such occasions. And of course, as a paleontologist, I have a lot of background in the origin of life and how life does and does not work. So a lot of that is relevant to this topic. And so that was something I thought would be useful in the background. And then Tim supplied a lot of the scholarship of things I didn't know about, which is mostly in the middle part of the book. So if you haven't seen, this book's been out a few years now. It's been doing pretty well, considering most people don't want to hear the message we gave. All right, so let's start by giving you a little bit of a background here. You don't have to read all the words. Don't worry, I know the back rows can't read the words anyway. This is December 13, 1909, and a con man named Wallace Tillinghast tells the Boston Herald that he's built a plane that can fly with 3 people for several minutes, for 30 minutes or so, up in the air. And at this time, 1909, that would be 6 years after the Wright brothers flew. That's a little beyond the level of what the Wright brothers, the Curtiss brothers, can do at that time. In fact, the 2 airplanes you see on the bottom of the slide are the Wright brothers plane in 1910 and the Curtiss brothers plane in 1910. So it was a not out of the question type of thing, but nonetheless, it was way in advance of what the others were doing. And so he made this claim. The newspapers picked it up uncritically. And then he told the newspapers he could not fly it in broad daylight so they could witness it. He had to fly it at night so that they would not steal his secrets and try to improve their airplanes. And from that point until almost Christmas Eve of that same year, over and over and over again, people claimed they saw this thing flying in the sky above them. All over New England and eventually New York City, they claimed they saw it flying against the moon. They claimed they saw it flying by the Statue of Liberty. All this stuff going on. And this whole craze just kept building over and over and over again. And then on 3 days before Christmas that year, finally, a reporter broke the story. It was all a hoax. Okay? 50,000 people claimed to see this thing flying in the sky, and it did not exist. Okay? And that's an important lesson to take from this. 50,000 people can be wrong. 50,000 eyewitnesses can see and hear things that don't exist. You know, the so-called mass delusion, the crowd mentality. They're told to hear or see things, and it's very easy at this. So if sometimes claims they saw a UFO and they say a bunch of other eyewitnesses saw it, it's not convincing evidence because we can very strongly show that that kind of thing is pretty much the norm. People are easily convinced of things as long as there's that kind of crowd mentality, mass delusional mentality, they will see what they expect to see. All right, before I get into the nitty-gritty of this talk, I need to say a few things about the scientific method, because this is what I really want to introduce that's different from a lot of what I see written about UFOs and aliens, is that they don't understand scientific method and or they don't apply it. And the first problem, of course, we need to get away from stereotypes. So I have 3 images up there on the screen of the classic stereotype of the male scientist with the wild frizzy hair, or in this case, the female scientist, but also with all the other toys that come with it, you know, the big sparking Van de Graaff generators and the bubbling beakers and the white lab coat. I'm a scientist. I haven't worn a lab coat since college. Okay, you only wear a lab coat if you're in chemistry or biomedicine or wherever you have the likelihood of splashing chemicals on your clothes. Otherwise, you don't have a reason to do it. A paleontologist would never use it for the field work, that's for sure. Okay, it's not about the lab coats. It's not about the beakers, the generators. It's a method of looking at the world. And it's the only method now, especially in the big cesspool that's called the internet, it's the only method that's self-critical and self-correcting. We have so much in the way of lies and misconceptions out there, and of course the internet spreads them very widely. Science is the only method that has some method of correcting itself, which I'll talk more about. It's called peer review. All right, and science is the only area where we actually have an outside reality to test whether our ideas are right or not. And so in that sense, it's self-correcting. But there are limits. Science doesn't answer questions about the supernatural. Some questions about alternative causes. For those who can't see it in the back, this is a famous almost Sidney Harris cartoon. Science operates by what's called naturalism, okay? The naturalistic assumption. We can only deal with things that can be tested in the scientific lab or in some method, and we can't deal with anything that's supernatural. And so the cartoon, if those who can't read it, says, then a miracle occurs. He has on the blackboard right in the middle, and the caption says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Okay? And with the problem we have, of course, in culture is that pseudoscience is still a huge part of what's going on around us, and a lot of pseudoscience is around there. So you have to be careful how we distinguish science from pseudoscience. Okay? And many pseudosciences, especially in dealing with things like aliens and so on, the supernatural explanations are very common. They assume supernatural. If they're dealing with ghosts, they assume ghosts are real, and if the evidence doesn't support it, they twist it to fit. Okay? A pseudoscientist or anyone else who's dedicated to a particular point of view, whenever you show evidence against it, they won't abandon their view as wrong. They will just twist it or ignore it or modify it or just whatever to get away from inconvenient evidence that doesn't consistently fit their ideas. A scientist, on the other hand, has to be self-critical and has to be critical of the data. If they see something unexplained, they ask, what are some possible natural causes? Not just jump to the conclusion, oh, a ghost moved it. Okay? And a scientist must abandon the evidence idea if the evidence is against it. This meme is one I've seen a long time on the internet. I love it, really. It says it very nicely. Science, if you don't make mistakes, you're doing it wrong. If you don't correct those mistakes, you're doing it really wrong. If you can't accept that you were mistaken, you're not doing it at all. And so in our context, there are certain issues that crop up all the time in evaluating the idea of UFOs and so on in science. And the first one is objectivity. People can subjectively believe or see things all the time. That doesn't really matter to a scientist. It's whether anyone else who wants to observe it can observe it, right? It's got to be observable by more than one individual, or it's just a subjective opinion. You always try to avoid bias, okay? You don't want to bias your experiments or observations to find what you seek to find. You don't assume that if you find something odd, it's unexplainable, as we'll talk about in a moment. In the case of many of these supernatural phenomena, how do you know it's not a random effect? If the curtains move, how do you know it's not the wind and not just the wind and not a ghost? Sounds and sights all the time interpreted as UFOs can often be other things. Okay, how strong is your evidence? Of how plausible is it in the face of all the facts against it? And I'll talk about that. And then finally, one more time for those who aren't familiar with it, in science we have what's called peer review. Every scientific paper published in a reputable journal has to pass through review of at least 2 or 3, and sometimes more, anonymous usually, reviewers, and they can be your worst enemies in the field. Okay, in fact, they usually are, and they can say anything they want about you because they're just anonymous. And you have to have a very thick skin if you really believe your data and believe your work is right. You either prove what you said and resubmit it, or go back to the drawing board and start again. But this is something that screens a lot of the garbage from ever being published. It's not perfect. A lot of garbage still gets published, not quite as much as you think, but it's the kind of thing that does filter what the internet and other parts of the media don't. Okay? And so things that we watch out for when we're saying baloney is the polite way to say it, bullshit or whatever you prefer. The first thing is anytime I hear someone special pleading or ad hoc hypothesis called, say aliens have supernatural powers, that's why they don't leave traces. Well, that's removed it from the realm of science right there. If you're trying to salvage your hypothesis by going to some kind of supernatural or ad hoc explanation, you stop doing science, okay? One of my famous favorite scientists of all time, Thomas Henry Huxley, was Darwin's biggest supporter. The great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact, okay? That is how things work, okay? One of the biggest problems we have with whether it's supernatural phenomena like ghosts or Bigfoot or UFOs is the burden of proof, okay? You have to be able to sustain the burden of proof. In the case of, let's say, evolution, In 1859, when Charles Darwin's book was first published, the burden of proof was on him to establish that evolution did in fact happen. Over the last century and a quarter now, that has been done very effectively. Okay? Now, if someone wants to overturn the giant body of evidence that supports evolution, like some creationists in the country do, the burden of proof is on them. Nobody has to support evolution now. Evolution is supported by a gigantic amount of evidence. Creationist has to overturn all of it to do that. In our context here, let's say our little cartoon person's here is saying, sometimes I turn into unicorn. And he says, oh yeah, prove it. Okay, he turns into unicorn, he satisfied the burden of proof. But if I say, sometimes I want to be able to turn into unicorn, I say, yeah, prove it. And then he says, you can't prove I don't. That's shifting the burden of proof, right? The burden of proof is something who's making an unconventional, outlandish claim. Until they can satisfy that burden of proof, nothing they say matters. Okay? And so, again, don't try to read all these slides here, just to remind me about things. Scientific consensus, then, of course, is something that takes sometimes decades, gigantic amounts of evidence, and gigantic amounts of work to establish. And so once it's reached, as I said in the case of Darwinian evolution since 1859, the burden of proof shifts. Anyone trying to overthrow it has to overthrow all of it, and not just one little part of it, which is the failure when you hear creationists talking about evolution. Well, the same goes for climate science. At this point now, since the 1970s, we've had so much evidence of climate change. Again, the burden of proof is on people who deny it's happening. So it's the context, you can think of a lawyer in a court case. In a civil court case, the preponderance of evidence is what establishes who's right and who's not. And usually in a civil court case, one side has to prove, usually the plaintiff, has to prove their case by the preponderance of evidence. Okay, that's not true in criminal court, but it is in civil court. That's the same kind of thing we're dealing with here. Okay? Or we want to go to other examples, which we assume everyone understands. There are Holocaust deniers out there, right? Holocaust deniers deny the Holocaust occurred. And you would think, my God, how can they think that in the 21st century? But there are a lot of them. The nation of Iran is still committed to Holocaust denial, if you hadn't heard that. Okay. All right, so there's a lot going on here. And the basic idea is that when something is established by the scientific or scholarly community after a century, or at least after decades, it's not going to be overturned by a couple of small examples. Okay. And so you can say that in the shortest terms by the famous phrase, which Carl Sagan makes most famous, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay? Now, another rule of thumb that we use in science a lot is what's called Occam's razor. The principle of parsimony is a fancy way to say that. And basically, William O. Occam was a 13th century monk who basically said the fewer assumptions, the simpler the assumptions explain something, the better. Right? Simplest explanation is best, is the simplest way of saying that. Now, it's not always the case that nature operates in the simplest possible way, but it's generally the case that most of the time the simplest explanation works in the absence of evidence pointing in some other direction. Okay, so when faced with more than one explanation, we say a hairy creature in the woods is more likely to be a bear than Bigfoot. Okay, an object in the sky is more likely a balloon than a flying saucer. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras, right? Unless you're in Africa and then you think zebras. Okay. Or here we go with Wile E. Coyote here, Occam's razor. Sure, there are cooler, simpler ways to catch that bird, but the complicated ones kick ass. And so I love this little meme. Occam's razor, a parsimonious shave every time. All right, so that's sort of the basic scientific groundwork that I've operated as I'm a scientist for 45 years now. And most scientists also operate the same way. Now let's apply it to this whole topic of UFOs and aliens. And so some of the basic rules are here, something we were talking about this afternoon's panel. Remember, unidentified flying object, or now unidentified anomalous phenomenon, is a newer version of it. Still, the first word is critical, unidentified. Okay? Unidentified simply means we don't know right now. It's not that it's supernatural automatically. Okay? The best way to say that is the unexplained is not necessarily unexplainable. Okay? Within science, lots of things were unexplained decades ago or years ago, and eventually natural explanations emerge for most things we don't understand when we first observe them. And that's the way scientists have to operate. We have to live with a bit of uncertainty. We have to live with things we don't yet now know the understanding of, but we accept that as part of our scientific creed, and we wait until such time as maybe better explanations come along. In most cases, something natural eventually comes along, okay? We do not jump to the conclusion that, oh, I don't understand, therefore supernatural. That's not a way a scientist operates. And there are a lot of people who operate that way, but not a scientific community and not a real scientist. And of course, you know how that's violated all the time in pop culture, especially on late night cable TV. The word unexplained is featured in the title of Unexplained Mysteries, Unexplained this. And that's, of course, implied when those shows go up there with that title, that unexplained, therefore supernatural. No. Unexplained just means we don't know the answer now. A scientist is patient. A scientist waits until better data come on. And some of these things may never be explained. I'm not going to worry about that, okay? And so here we go. Got to watch out for people who jump from I don't know to therefore aliens, okay? And so we just talked about this afternoon in the panel I was on earlier. The Congress testimony that we heard about, these guys were hearing secondhand sources from third-hand sources, which in a court of law would be hearsay and not admissible. And none of them actually witnessed any of this stuff they claimed to Congress. It all basically, as we said this afternoon, amounted to a giant nothing burger. But of course, the media played it up like suddenly the government secrets about UFOs have all been exposed. Okay. And so this is Brian Cox, the famous British astronomer, reflecting on that testimony that was just happening. I keep being asked what I make of the UFO thing in Congress yesterday, so here it is. I watched a few clips and saw some people who seemed to believe stuff saying extraordinary things without presenting extraordinary evidence. I therefore have nothing more to say other than it would be great if true. It would take a bit of the pressure off our civilization if we weren't the only ones out there in the Milky Way or the universe understands itself. Sadly, as of today, I still feel the pressure, so we can perhaps focus not on messing our world up, rather than hoping to have to paraphrase Sagan, somebody will float down to save us from ourselves. All right, so what are the standards of evidence now that we apply in science? What is it that's going to convince the scientific community, and not just those who are paranormal believers, that these things are real, okay? And it's not what you think it is, okay? A lot of people are really convinced, oh, well, all these witnesses saw this. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Really, I would say primarily the only evidence that would get most scientific community to actually believe any of this is the actual physical evidence, an actual UFO that was not explainable by natural processes, an actual alien or alien carcass that was not a hoax on Fox News, okay? That's pretty much the only thing that would make it convincing to most of us, okay? Much of the evidence that's out there, so-called evidence, I'll put in quotes, is videos, photos, and things like that. And as you all know, they're so easily faked now. I mean, most of us have enough command of Photoshop and fake it, okay? And in the old days, it was harder to do, but it wasn't that hard, okay? What we don't consider hardly evidence at all is burn marks, landing traces, strange objects. There's, throughout the book, we have Tim got so many objects that were claimed to have supernatural origin, and we found natural explanations for them. What's not considered evidence by any scientist I know is eyewitness accounts. The worst and least useful piece of evidence is eyewitness accounts. So why do we say that? Here we go. I'm here in southern Los Angeles in this picture. That's the Griffith Park Planetarium right there. In fact, this is by the old CFI building. And there's an alien spacecraft flying over it. And there's another shot I grabbed. And there's another shot I grabbed. And this is what was going on. Jim Underdown was holding up a long fishing pole with a monofilament line and swinging a model spacecraft up in the air in a circle. And we all took our turns with our cameras taking pictures of it. Very easy fake. And the monofilament line would be impossible to see in most images that don't have that resolution because it's designed to be invisible, right? That's how it catches fish. Okay? And yet, we still have people who won't listen. You know, I try to tell people there's no evidence, and they're talking to a brick wall. Okay? So why do we say eyewitness evidence is useless? Okay? And of course, this is something that's changed over the last 30, 40 years. At one time, back when I was in jury duty as a graduate student, you know, eyewitness evidence was considered the best in the court of law. And the lawyers always tried to get as many eyewitnesses as they could, even though, of course, they showed often that they often are not very reliable. What's been discovered by Elizabeth Loftus and many other people now is that humans are terrible video recorders. Our sight and our memory do terrible things in actually recording what we actually saw, much worse than most people credit it for. We're easily fooled by looking at things we saw or didn't see, and after the fact, our memories are colored by all sorts of stuff, especially cultural factors. So even if we did see something, we may actually color it by what our brain tells us it should be, because our brain is always trying to fit it into a box of something that's familiar. And if we've been exposed to UFO imagery our whole lives and watching UFO programs and X-Files for a long enough time, that's what our brains will do, okay? We are easily convinced by the testimony of our neighbor, which is anecdotal evidence, but the anecdotal evidence is not scientific evidence, right? Not convincing to a scientist that someone said they saw something. My good friend Frank Soloway said it this way: anecdotes don't make science. 10 anecdotes are no better than 1, and 100 anecdotes no better than 10. To give you some examples, famous case in 2004, a hunter was out with his son hog hunting, and someone hollered hog. He turned around, he saw something looked like a hog to him, he shot at it. It was his son wearing that cap you see in the top picture. Killed his son, okay? Mike Shermer, of course, head of the Skeptics Society, who tells the story often. When he did these big bicycle races across America, he rode these, of course, marathon rides where he would be on the bicycle for 18 straight hours without getting off. And at the end of that kind of physical stress, even in the condition you have to be to do that kind of race, he started hallucinating. And he actually hallucinated his support van, which is up in front of him trying to get him off the bike, was a giant spacecraft trying to capture him, okay? Some of you remember the 2002 DC sniper panic. Police actually had the culprits pass through their checkpoints multiple times because they'd been told that the suspects were white shooters in a white box van, and turned out to be 2 black men in a black sedan. And that's why they let him go so long until they finally captured him, right? So it's all about these perceptions we have, and anything can be a UFO if you're bad enough at identifying stuff, okay? And corollary with that, something that's very big in UFO mythology is memories. That our experiences are often altered after the fact, that we saw maybe one thing, and then as the more we talk about it, the more we think about it, we enhance it, we change it. This has been documented by psychologists many, many times. Especially things like UFO abductions and so on. They're often, the story gets more and more elaborate the more time it's told. And a lot of it comes from things like, for example, someone has sleep paralysis. They have a short, bad experience in bed where they feel like their limbs are captured and they're being hallucinating this thing. And then, of course, later on, they embellish the story larger and larger and larger, okay? Another thing you have to be careful of, especially when you're talking to people who don't have Western thinking patterns, you're dealing with non-Western thinking patterns, especially in parts of the world that are less developed, they don't always distinguish between their mythology and reality, right? Or their dreams and reality. To them, it's all reality. And so you got to be careful what you're using there. But the biggest problem, again, is that it's very much tied to the culture it comes from, okay? People see something they don't recognize, they can't explain, they immediately attach a cultural familiar label to it to explain it, to give it some meaning to them, okay? And we all know this phenomenon. It's got a fancy name. It's called pareidolia. And it's the basis for the Rorschach test, which I have there on the bottom of the slide. Your mind can make a pattern out of anything. It's programmed to do that, right? It's what's called type 1 error, that you're programmed to see lions in the grass rather than to see something else. Because in the old days when you were a prey of a lion in East Africa, right, it was survival at stake, okay? So we are always programmed to see things where they aren't there. Just a handful of images, all the thing it takes is a couple of objects in the right position to be eyes and a nose and a mouth, and you can see faces and everything, because we're conditioned to see faces early in life. From the time our mother is taking care of us, that's one of the first faces our memories lock onto. And of course, as you know, especially in, say, Roman Catholic countries, Jesus and Mary show up on everything, from burnt toast to a glass window to a stump. And of course, so there I've got Darwin in a cloud, Darwin on the toast, and Darwin on stump. But this has shown up in the stuff with the literature of UFOs and aliens. Famous fraudster made a big fuss out of this 1976 Viking image on the left. It was a very low-res image of a very small hill taken with just a few pixels, basically, not very big at all. And the lighting was very poor, right? It's basically one all or nothing light source. But it sort of looks like a face. And this guy made millions in the face on Mars, okay? There on the right is what it actually looks like with different lighting and better resolution from the 2001 Mars Global Surveyor. And you can see no face anymore. It was all an artifact of just the lighting and the low resolution, all right? And so there's that same image. As the image got better from left to right, it looks less and less like a face. You see this in things, for example, lots of people get really spooked by these lens-shaped clouds over mountains, especially Mount Shasta, which is famous of woo veterans all over. These are called lenticular clouds. I teach meteorology, so I got to be pretty familiar with these. And they're often called UFO clouds because they're shaped like a big disc. They're just caused by the way air currents flush over tops of mountains. As they rise over a certain elevation, they cross the dew level and they crystallize out or vaporize out their water powder. Then they lower again, they evaporate, and the cloud ends. All right, I don't have time to talk about every example of aliens, landings, and other type of thing. I'm going to talk about just a couple. There are many, many more in the book, and I'll refer to that for this. We'll start with Area 51, which I'm on my shirt now. Area 51, for those who can't see, and I can't really point to it, I don't think, but anyway, it's up there, that green square, almost the center. It's an old desert playa called Groom Lake. It's surrounded by Nellis Air Force Base and the Nevada test site, so it's completely within federal, mostly military property. So no person can get there without proper access. It was chosen deliberately because you cannot see it from any road that public can access it. And that was so it could be secret. And it's clearest town is up to the north of it there, Rachel, Nevada, which I've been to several times. I ran a tour up there once. That's what it looks like from there now, thanks to Google Images and Google Maps. You can see it anytime you want. It's a big dry lake with a bunch of landing strips that have been built on it and a handful of buildings. That's all it is. Nothing like in the movies. I've been as close to it as you're allowed to get before they run down and capture you. There's a couple of points you can approach it, and then all the warning signs are up, and then, of course, the sensors will go off if you pass them. There's a little spot called the Little Alien there on the bottom, which I've been to a couple times. I ran a tour there, where they have a little restaurant and a couple of houses and so on, and a big old TV saucer, flying saucer, hanging out the front. What happened to Groom Lake, Area 51? It was originally built right after World War II as a test area for secret aircraft. And the whole point of it was a good flat, dry lake where they could easily land craft and build a landing strip without having to do much work, but it was completely blocked by mountains on all sides so no one in the public could see it. The first craft they developed, of course, was the famous U-2, which, of course, as those who ever watched the movies or know some history, was shot down over the Russian mainland in 1959. And before that, it was in the air for a long time as our main spy craft. Okay? Then, during the 60s and especially the 70s, the U-2 was replaced by a much more impressive aircraft. This is eventually called the SR-7 Blackbird. It's a different version of it. This thing flew at Mach 3 about 90,000 feet. Okay? My dad worked for Lockheed Aircraft his whole career, and he worked on every one of these planes, and they were all top secret for a very, very long time. And so this plane and the other planes were all tested at Area 51. And then the most recent plane to be tested there while it was still secret, of course, was the F-117 Nighthawk, which is also a Lockheed craft. All these planes were kept secret for a reason, right? The U.S. Air Force and the CIA didn't want the Soviets to know what we had. And they didn't mind that there was a story about UFOs and aliens around Area 51, even though they didn't promote it, but it provided them good cover so that the Russians weren't as curious about it as they could have been, okay? Well, to make a long story short, in 2013, the Freedom of Information Act, all the documentation of Area 51 has been fully released in public. You can look it up online. Everything is out. Okay, there are no secrets left anymore. Freedom of Information Act did this. Not only that, but the Lockheed contractors, including my dad, many of them are called the Roadrunners if they still belong to this club. They are all free of their non-disclosure agreements. They're all free to talk, and many of them have, and their books published of what they did. Okay, and basically the short answer is what they did is the spy craft were up there, and during the time they were secret, not even other Air Force pilots knew what they were. So they were often Air Force pilots reporting things they didn't understand. These were not anything unusual. They're just secret to anybody but those who had clearance. And the point being that if you have a craft that flies like the SR-71 did, 90,000 feet at Mach 3, and you're in an airline plane about 40,000 feet, it's twice as high as you are, traveling 4 times as fast as you are, and it's shaped, as you saw in the previous slide, very strangely, especially if the light from the sun hits it, and you would not know what that is. Okay, and you certainly wouldn't, as you're a civilian air pilot, know what it is because it's secret. So we now know from all the various reports that have been tracked down, the highest percentage, almost 95% of all UFO reports in the western U.S. are from airline pilots who saw the Blackbird flying above them and didn't know what it was. That's all it is. It turned out most of those have been explained now. And again, CIA and the Air Force and the rest didn't mind that people were looking for aliens because it gave them cover. Okay? But of course, Hollywood is out to make a buck from having you pay for their movies. They don't care about truth, right? Hollywood's making fiction. So we have things like this movie, of course, which made this giant story of Area 51, all of which was, of course, garbage. All right? I say that because my dad, this is a picture of him, he worked for Lockheed his entire career from 1938 to retired in 1978. One company his whole life, retired early even. He had highest security clearance, and he was at Area 51. I didn't know this when I was younger. It was long after he retired and he'd been released from his non-disclosure agreements that he were watching a late-night cable TV show about aliens at Area 51. He was laughing his head off because he was there. You know, it was nothing but aircraft hangars and a few quarters for the staff and the military personnel, but he was one of the civilian contractors who flew the Janet flights out of Vegas up to Area 51 several times, and he was never allowed to talk about it, even to my mom. All right, now quickly, just to keep time from running out, I'll say a little bit about Roswell, New Mexico. This is the other sort of golden spot where UFO crazies have been interested for a long time. Just to show you where it is, in the southwestern part of New Mexico. It was some debris that was found by a rancher and then eventually brought into town and then taken to a nearby Air Force base. If you've ever been to Roswell, this is the #1 source of income of the city. Everything is UFO and alien themed, okay? Everywhere you go, they all know how to make a buck, okay? Now, what are the facts behind this, okay? Start with what I said this afternoon when we were talking in the panel. It was on June 14, 1947, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold flying over Oregon and Washington. We're not even talking about New Mexico here. He was seeing something that looked sort of like, to him, like a boomerang, but he described it as skipping like saucers or skipping like stones across the surface the way it moved. When he got back, the reporters who reported what he said garbled the story into flying saucers. So the original report didn't even describe a saucer, okay? During the summer of 47, there was a huge media craze about flying saucers. Everybody was paying attention at the time, okay? Reports got everywhere. And the irony is, this event happened in 1947 at a time we were hypersensitive to the idea of people from outer space, and no one connected it to it because it did not appear to be that, okay? The events itself, in June 14, 47, about a few days just before their first report, the ranch foreman, Rebazell, finds the crash site, brings the material in, reports it to some people, eventually gets to the Air Force. I don't go into the details here, but it's all in the book if you want to do it. And eventually makes a newspaper and starts being called a flying saucer, but that was about as far as it went. Now, unknown to these people at the same time, the CIA was running a thing called Project Mogul, which all the people who are involved in that have also released what they were doing at the time, which was then secret. Project Mogul was a whole bunch of these various reflectors and others that were being carried by weather balloons out of that area in New Mexico. And the project was designed to pick up signals from Soviet nuclear blasts. It was an attempt to figure out how to tell what the Soviets are doing with nuclear testing. Eventually, seismologists turned out to be the most useful doing it. But back then, they were trying things like radar and all things like that to do it. So these are balloons, just top secret, with a bunch of sort of tinfoil flaps hanging off of them. That's all it was. We now know from the people who are in the project that this particular crash was one of their lost balloons that got in a thunderstorm and got struck by lightning and then landed where they didn't intend to catch it. That's all it was. It's already been told to us by the people who did this. Nonetheless, this is the images of General Ramey and Jesse Marcel, the major at the time, looking at it. And you can see it's basically just tinfoil, like a big kite. It had some other stuff on it. It had some tape on it that had little animal patterns. The Roswell crazies insist that's alien writing, but it was actually kids' toy tape. And this is all that was left when it came off the weather balloon and hit the ground. It was all falling apart. It was mostly balsa wood and tinfoil, okay? And at the time it happened, 1947, the country was crazy about it, and they never connected this to any kind of alien story. In fact, it died and was forgotten for over 30 years. Okay, and then in 78, two guys who were interested in the whole story, trying to make a buck, start digging up the story about it and write a book about it. And they actually dig up Jesse Marcel, who at this point was trying to make a living. He was out of work, didn't have any retirement from the Army that could amount to much. And he ended up telling him a bunch of stuff 40 years essentially after the fact that they filled the book with, which is very non-credible now, and did not look into the story of Project Mogul, which had not been released yet. They made a killing selling this story on the books and then eventually on TV. That's all there is to it. It's just a classic example of something that was secret at the time, like our spy planes were, and that particular Project Mogul becoming a part of it. And then it didn't even pick up at the time it happened, like spy planes turning into UFO reports. It was all about 30 years later, these guys writing a book trying to make Roswell a business. It's a giant nothing burger. And so here we go. Our aliens are, we're going to crash. We better throw out some Air Force dummies. All right. So again, the facts, it's basically a classic example of the quantity of garbage over quality of the data. There's just no real support for it in the kind of stuff we're talking about here. Okay, and again, the people who actually, like George Bilderberg and others who actually did the Project Mogul have come out, testified, written about it. So the people who actually released the project, released the craft, have all been come out, but nobody wants to listen to them. You know, it's too much money to be made, especially in the town of Roswell. Okay, again, for time reasons, I won't read this long quote from Bilderberg's book, but he's one of the people who released that particular Mogul balloon himself and can tell you the whole detail what he did in these stories they released. All right, so again, remember, what happens in Roswell stays in Roswell. Here we go, our aliens sending us a little card from New Mexico. All right, and again, there's many, many, many examples. I just went about Area 51 and Roswell, just as two of them, the most famous ones. But most of you know the story behind some of these other ones. The Phoenix Lights are a famous example of people flying flares off balloons, or another example of a Phoenix Lights were military craft that were not reported right away. They were flying in formation, which we talked about this afternoon. Some of you know about the infamous so-called alien autopsy video, which was played on Fox and on late-night TV before it was revealed as a hoax. It was transparently a hoax as soon as it was released. Okay, and then we come to crop circles. Okay, this is some people's favorite evidence for aliens coming to this planet. People still believe that aliens come across many, many, many light years of distance just to draw patterns in their crops and leave. Okay, that to me is about as far away from Occam's razor as you can think. Not only that, but we know that crop circles in most cases have already been established. The hoaxers have come out, and it's not hard. You have a board and a stake and a rope to make something that'll sculpt patterns in crops. And people we know now do this all the time, including the farmers themselves. Okay, so if I ever 12,000 light years to a planet uninhabited, intelligent life, let's just make patterns in their crops and leave. Or here are two aliens doing tic-tac-toe in the crops. I love to mess with their minds. Okay, all right, so evidence thin and none, basically. I mean, all this stuff that you hear over and over and over again, unexplained this and mysterious that. It's unexplained and mysterious. It's not unexplainable, okay? And so this is something to keep in mind when you're looking at these reports that are made out here, okay? So then the question is, why hasn't ET phoned home, okay? If there's something out there that's intelligent and could reach us, why have we not heard from them? Why have we not discovered them? And lately, it seems like they should be out there. All the time you hear that our estimate of exoplanets outside the solar system is increasing all the time. Our telescopes are getting better and better resolution, especially the James Webb telescope. So we're discovering more and more of these things. So you think the question would be, you know, why are we not seeing them? Why are we not hearing them? You know, what evidence do we have that they're not actually trying to reach us? I would put this the way some of my colleagues have done, especially those of us who have a background in geology and paleontology and the history of life on Earth. It's not as likely as you think it is that life has reached intelligent stage. It's not to say that some kind of simple microbial life is not found elsewhere. That I would buy easily if the evidence emerged. You know, if we found microbial life on Mars, I would not be shocked, okay? Microbial life is very easy to produce, right? We know now amino acids are found in meteorites, which means they're all over the universe. It's not that hard to go from there to something a little more complicated. And we know microbial life can live in extreme conditions, from hot springs that are boiling to extreme cold conditions, even kilometers down the Earth's crust, microbial life can live. So if you're saying, why is there no life elsewhere? I would say, okay, I'll buy microbial life. Microbial life doesn't bother me at all. Okay, it's very plausible. But that's a big jump from life that can communicate or travel to visit us. There's a lot of steps in the way there between life on a simple bacterial level and life as we are talking about it here. And there's the big problem. You ask someone, well, why don't we find life on other planets? Or is there life on other planets? And I say, well, I will buy it if there are bacteria on other planets. But aliens that can talk to us and travel to us, communicate with us, I'm a little more skeptical. I'm one of those people who would argue the rare earth hypothesis. There's so many unlikely coincidences and unusual events that are required to make how we are now happen that I don't think it's as plausible as most people seem to think, especially those who aren't biologically trained, because it's really a biological problem. As much as it is part of physics and planetary science, it's also biological. Okay? Let's just run down some of the things that make Earth really, really unusual as planetary body goes. And as far as you know, none of the other exoplanets we've looked at go through all of these. First of all, as you know, you have to, and this is something they always account for when they look at these extraterrestrial planets, you have to be in what's called the Goldilocks zone. You can't be too close to their star or too far from their star, or your water is either boiling off like Venus is to us now, or frozen like it is on Mars. You have to be in that narrow band with the temperature coming from your host star is just the right temperature so you have liquid water. Because we do not imagine life without liquid water being very likely, or at least complex life. Maybe microbial life can do it, of course, but not complex life. Earth is protected by our big brother, Jupiter. Those who don't really think about this much, but Jupiter is a giant gravitational magnet. Many objects that would have struck the Earth are deflected by Jupiter's gravity before they pass toward us. That's a major thing to consider. We have a large moon. Our moon is larger compared to its host body, the Earth, than moons of any other planet. It's a very stabilizing effect. It keeps our tilt of our axis from wobbling very much and keeps our surface more or less at a consistent distance from the various sources of energy, especially the sun. Many planets don't have this. As some of you know, the planet Uranus is on its side, okay? Or excuse me, Neptune's on its side, sorry. So there's other types of configurations that differ from Earth, and we're the only one that has a really large moon that stabilizes it. We have a nearly circular orbit. It has a slight eccentricity, but it's nearly circular, so the amount of energy we get from each passage around it is fairly consistent. All right. As far as we know, Earth is the only one that has a magnetic field, which generates our magnetosphere, which blocks solar radiation. The solar wind is called. Protects us from the effects of it, except for some UV, and most organisms have ways of dealing with that. We have other things to think about as well. But the biggest thing, so far as we know, all these other exoplanets we've looked at, there's no evidence of gaseous oxygen in their atmospheres. And Earth didn't have that either when it started, right? The Earth's early atmosphere started with mostly being hydrogen, helium, then mostly methane and ammonia and nitrogen. Now it's mostly nitrogen, as you know, with 21% oxygen, all of which arose over the last 3 billion years, 2.4 mostly. And that is particularly for the product of life, of photosynthesis. That is something that most complex forms of life we think of other than plants require. Free oxygen is not easy to make in atmospheres without life. And pretty much life creates the atmosphere that we're used to, okay? And so without that, you can imagine a more complex form of life that doesn't operate with oxygen, but it's really hard to imagine how it would work, and especially how it would work in our context, okay? All right, so all those things basically, and then the fact that the whole planet works in this very fine biological geochemical cycle where life produces oxygen, absorbs CO2, and cycles all these things in such a way that we maintain a fairly stable atmosphere and a fairly stable climate, although, of course, now we're changing that. Okay, so put all this together. Yes, I believe microbial life is very likely elsewhere. But to get all the steps of the way to get to humans is another thing altogether. And especially because the argument of what's called contingency. My good friend Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of my mentors, although I was never formally a student, put it this way. If you imagine the history of life as a giant reel-to-reel tape recorder or something antique like that, all right? And you play it the way it is now. And then you rewind it and play it again. Any lucky accident, any surprise will change the event, and you will not get the same result twice, okay? If something hadn't happened to this planet 66 million years ago, there's no reason to think the dinosaurs wouldn't still be here, and you and I would be the size of little shrews running around under their feet, right? That's an accident. The dinosaurs are not badly adapted. The dinosaurs are not failures like we typically treat them that way. They were successful for 120 million years. Or the age of mammals has barely been longer than 60 million years. They had a year of success 120 million years longer than we've had. And, again, if people don't realize this, dinosaurs and mammals arose at the same time in the late Triassic. And yet, for 2/3 of mammalian history, dinosaurs ruled the earth. There's no reason to think that if they had not had a bad day in the Cretaceous, they would not be still here. Now, if that was the case, you and I wouldn't be talking. No one would be trying to communicate with other planets or wondering why aliens weren't communicating with us, because you and I would be running around like little shrews in the vegetation. Okay? That didn't have to happen. There was no guaranteeing it. It was not a predictable event. The history of life would be totally different without that event at the end of the Cretaceous. And other mass extinctions also, which had unusual combinations of circumstances, transformed life entirely. There's no reason to think that would ever repeat. In other words, there's no predictability. You run the tape over and over again, you'll get different results, none of which necessarily predict us sitting in this room right now. Okay? We're lucky accidents of history is the basic point. Okay? I don't know if that makes you feel better, but yes. So that's the problem. We're so human anthropocentric that we always think humans are the ultimate product of evolution. But what paleontology and evolution have taught us now over the last several years, especially the last 30 years especially, is that we're just one possible pathway. That humans are not inevitable, that you and I are talking in this room is not an obvious product. It goes back to our religious anthropocentrism that goes back to humans are the center of God's eye. But no, there's no reason to think we'd be here at all without a lot of accidents happening. And so this is a famous example. My friend Dale Russell passed away a while ago, famously decided he would play around with the idea of this, what was then a stenonychosaur. The idea, if dinosaurs had survived, would they evolve to be human-like? And they had this famous sculpture made of a humanoid, which got tremendous laughter from both scientists and the press when it came out in the 70s. And of course, it makes all the wrong assumptions, right? There's no reason to think a stenonychosaur would ever evolve to look like a human, because most of what makes humans humans are primate features that came from animals that climb in trees, which stenonychosaurs never did. Okay? And some other things to think about. Okay? Our reach of our broadcast is not that big over even that inner part of the Milky Way galaxy. A lot of people point out that, as we did this afternoon, human civilization's ability to reach out to space is barely 100 years old if it's that far for the first radios. Okay? We haven't been around that long to even have anyone hear us, let alone if any other civilization exists out there, whether it's already gone or whether it's going to happen in the future, we aren't going to be communicating with it. Okay? And then we'll get things like this. I bet aliens right past Earth and lock their doors. We're destroying our planet, too. So the idea of the aliens visiting us lost its appeal when they realized just likely be some other planet's asshole billionaires. Okay. But finally, the really important thing that's really makes me skeptical of the way we think about UFOs and aliens is that it's really strongly tied to culture, right? If you think about it, the alien phenomenon is really a product of the late 19th, early 20th, and then the rest of this time since then, centuries, because it's tied very strongly to the birth of science fiction and comic books in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Before those days, if someone saw something in the sky that looked weird, a light in the sky they couldn't explain, it was a god. It was angels. It was Mary and Joseph, whatever, okay? It did not have this supernatural alien type of thing. Not only do people not see aliens outside the part of the world that's exposed to sci-fi like we are, but they see something totally different because that's what their culture tells them to see. That's the pattern they're expecting, okay? And that even if applies the way aliens have changed. There's various versions of what aliens look like there at the bottom of the slide. The familiar one that you're used to thinking from Steven Spielberg's movies is only a later version, the small gray that they call it. And there are many other types out there, and all of them are culture, right? None of them are based on actual facts, okay? So, for example, this is, for those who can't see, this is a map of the globe of the world, and reported UFO sightings. Notice where they occur. U.S., parts of Europe, especially Great Britain, which is also crazy about UFOs, hardly anything elsewhere in the world. Why? Because our culture obsesses about them, and hardly any other culture in the world ever talks about them, so people don't see them. Okay? And even that is cultural bound in the sense, if you think about it, H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds in 1895. Whereas aliens like Spielberg's, no. Those who know the original novel, they're sort of spider-like or octopus-like. Right? Totally different from what we're used to now. That was the very first sci-fi Martian, if you will, that became familiar to a lot of people. And as you know, during the Cold War, it took a different shape. The famous movie The Day the Earth Stood Still had two kinds. One looked like an ordinary human, and one that was a giant robot, which of course had an actor inside. The little gray alien that Steven Spielberg made so popular, we can actually trace its origin. It goes back to a 1964 episode of The Outer Limits, those who are old enough to remember that show, called the Bolero Shield. That's the first imagery of something that's now the familiar image of the aliens. Then, thanks to Spielberg's movies, everyone sees that. And so everyone has been culturally exposed to think that's what aliens are supposed to look like, even though not before 1964. Okay? And as I said before, the flying saucer craze, same thing. The guy actually didn't say saucers. The reporters garbled it. It was a common thing in comic books at the time to talk about these. And they were popular in that media, but they were not that popular outside of it until the flying saucer craze of 1947. So all of these things are cultural. They come from mostly US and British culture and a few other places, and from media, which both pick up what they hear and then they feed it back to us, okay? So almost everything you find in the alien literature. The notion of alien implants comes from the invaders from Mars, alien abductions. Buck Rogers started with those, but there's the examples of invaders from Mars, Island Earth, The 21st Day, the Dying Worlds motif from several movies, including This Island Earth and 27th Day. Notice of interbreeding with aliens in Voyage of the Damned and V. Some of you remember the famous Betty and Barney Hill case where they claimed they're UFO abductees. That was something that was also copycatted from earlier stories, and then it's been really copycatted ever since then. And it's pretty clear it's mostly sleep paralysis of what they're experiencing. Okay, so just to wrap up here, all right, quick summary of what we talked about. Area 51, my dad was there, okay? Nothing more than spy planes, but they wanted to keep those secret. So yes, they were not trying to suppress all the talk about alien bodies and craft that were to be there. Virtually every UFO claim in recent years has been exposed by the Freedom of Information Act in 2013. Most of them turn out to be, if they were in the western U.S., spy planes that other aircraft could not recognize and other pilots couldn't recognize because they were secret and they were traveling at Mach 3 at 90,000 feet. Okay? The Roswell incident, classic case of a secret thing again, in this case Project Mogul, a weather balloon with a bunch of tinfoil hanging down from it. That became a whole industry unto itself on basically nothing. Almost every other UFO sighting comes down to basically either people can't see what it is, or it's been explained, or even if we don't yet explain it, which is not a few percent of what's left, again, the unexplained is not necessarily unexplainable. We just don't know yet, okay? All right, let's see, what else? So these are all basically things to keep in mind as you talk about this, okay? Most of this is giant amount of media taking your money, okay? Media love to give you stories that you will pay for. And it goes from Spielberg all the way down to the cheap stuff on TV, okay? We love it, and in some cases I think we need it. You know, it gives us this kind of a sense of we have something unexplained and mysterious. I'm wrapping up, don't worry. And then as we point out several times this afternoon, a little cartoon here, percentage U.S. population carrying a camera everywhere, all their waking moments. In the very last few years, the very few fanfare, we conclude to exclusively settle the question of flying saucers, leg monsters, ghosts, and UFOs. And then the camera's invented, then the number of miracles disappears, and Photoshop invented, miracles go back again. Okay, so psychologists point out we tend to want to believe in the mysterious, the unexplained, and a lot of cultures still have monster stories. A lot of them really want to believe in this kind of thing. About 20, 30% of the American culture still believes in it. The culture really does feed this stuff, right? X-Files, I want to believe, the truth is still out there, is that common motif. And then here we go, a majority of abductions committed by alien that person knows. So anyway, I'll finish with Neil deGrasse Tyson here. If we were abducted by aliens, the first thing I'd ask is whether they came from a planet where the people also deny science. Thank you. Okay, is that Angie sparkling in the background there?
It is. It's
Go ahead.
sparkling.
I'm ready for questions. Ready for you to throw fruit at me, whatever.
Not even a little bit. But I will say that I have a question from my mother, so be nice,
Okay.
please.
I know she's a believer.
I know.
I'll do
She
what I
is.
can.
So she said, I watched the recent congressional hearings and 2 national press conferences on the subject. There is something there. Maybe from our future, our past, another dimension, frequency, another planet, underwater, other side of the moon. Who knows? But there is something. And I said, do you want me to ask him this question? She said, he does not know the answer. Maybe all of the above. I said, what makes you think he won't be able to answer your questions? He said, maybe he knows.
Okay,
So,
well, I did answer it, but I will say it
I
again.
know, but you know the feed
The
is
whole
not
Christian
the feed
testimony
is not as great as we
basically
hope.
was a bunch of third-hand and fourth-hand reports by people who never actually saw it themselves, and not in any way firsthand. And all they said is they did not have an explanation for what they saw, which again is my main takeaway. The unexplained is not unexplainable. You know, if we don't know the answer, it's not enough to just say, oh, well, therefore aliens, as I showed you earlier. You've got to actually have some sense of, we got to take time. We got to let this data sift out, because most of the time unexplained is explained by something perfectly natural. Is that a good enough answer, or do you want me to go on the other things? All right, well, I got some in the back there. Let's go on to the next question.
Yeah, I totally share your degree of skepticism, but I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about science's own self-inflicted wounds. And I'd cite as 2 examples. One is the tendency for scientists to engage in p-hacking in order to show statistically significant results in order to get published. And number 2, the most recent scandal with Gina Francesca at Harvard Business School, who was widely recently discovered to have fraudulently developed some of her findings in order to get published. So if you could talk about, like, maybe that's why some people are distrusting science, and what can we do about it?
Well, the good news is you know about those answers because science exposed it, right? The point being that sooner or later, enough other scientists, if it's important enough and interesting enough other scientists will try to replicate whoever you're doing, and they will try to double check it. And maybe there's more that's not yet exposed, but eventually, if it's important, enough people check it that it is exposed. And I'm not saying peer review is perfect. I mean, a good part of what shows up in the high-profile media like Science and Nature, 5 years later, turns out to be not true. That's fine. That's how science is self-correcting. Remember, when it gets into Science and Nature, it only needed 2 or 3 reviewers to get published. And that's okay. That's the only way they can operate. But what happens if it's a really outlandish claim or it's a really important claim, people will drop what they're doing to replicate it. People will check it out because they have the equipment to do it, or they have a technology that the original paper doesn't have. And then that claim goes through vetting after year. And I, as a textbook author especially, this is something I'm very aware of. If something really hot in the news, I don't necessarily want to put it in the textbook. Like they say, oh, this is going to change all the textbooks. No. What I do is I wait for several years and go to the meetings every year to learn what people are doing, because usually it's debunked in 3 or 4 years, and I'm glad I didn't put it in the textbook, okay? Because we almost always find that happens. But the point is, if it's important enough, people will do it, okay? This happened, for example, in the cold fusion story, which you may be familiar with, right? It made huge publicity. These scientists were trying their hardest to establish this had happened, but it was such a radical claim. Within months, actually within weeks, they had debunked it, okay? Because if it's important enough, the scientific community will figure it out, and they will get established whether it's real or not. So yes, science are human. Scientists make mistakes. Scientists sometimes accidentally make mistakes. Sometimes scientists are fraudulent. There's no way to avoid that. But the way it works is that if it's important enough, science will correct it too. Okay, next question.
I remember reading somewhere that the myth about aliens abducting cows came from the CIA using helicopters and taking cows from farms and running some experiments on them. Can you maybe
I haven't heard that
elaborate?
one. There's a lot of versions of it. Cows get killed in the field for lots of reasons, and the older the story is, the less likely I take that data very seriously. I mean, yes, if there's some reason the CIA wants to capture cows, spending money on a helicopter rather than just using a cowboy, I don't know why. Those are things are more, the more outlandish they sound like that, the more I think they're probably just a mythology that's crept up.
I'm sorry, Don, but I'm kind of creeping up on you.
Oh, I can see you. You're pretty sparkly.
So I don't hear myself. There we go. So we've got about 8 seconds left for your shameless plugs.
Okay, I guess I'm on a panel tomorrow at 2:30 about academics and skepticism, and my book on this is out there. If you just look on Amazon, you can find it. So
Excellent. Thank you so much, Don. We really appreciate your coming.
thank you.
I'm certain that other people have other questions, and you can meet Don outside if you are amenable to answer more questions. It's getting kind of late, and this is your first Dragon
Yeah, and
Con.
you got a disco to go to.
Indeed. Well, we can just stay here and boogie. But, yeah, right? Anyway, so thank you so much for coming to Dragon Con. Please stay with us in about half an hour. We're going to have the Wait, Don't Fool Me. Take care. Bye-bye.